Good morning, Sacha. So I'm excited that you're here today because you and I are going to have a discussion about copy editing and story editing. And what I'd like to cover and quiz you about today is where's the line between copy editing and story editing? And does it blur? And are there things that um, a copy editor might do and a story editor might do? And so you would find it in both types of edits. So before we get started, maybe you could tell our audience a little bit about yourself.
Yes. Okay. So I have been writing forever, and I am now a nonfiction author of writing craft books that help people to create better characters, to write better prose. And I also write young adult fiction. And I am a podcaster. I'm the host of the Rebel Author podcast, and I also co-host the Next Level Authors podcast with Dan Wilcox, which is mostly just full of banter and like us trying to be very transparent about how we level up our business, our writing business. What else? I'm also I'm actually the very first Fictionary certified story coach. So I'm super proud of that accolade. And I am predominantly, I would say, a copy editor, although I also love story editing. And so I am one of these editors that probably doesn't help that blurring line when it comes to, and we will get into this, but yeah, so I will do developmental edits, and I will do more copy editing, but my love, I think, probably sits on the copy editing side, although I don't do like all of a copy edit because I don't do like commas and punctuation, but I'm sure we'll get into that. So yeah, I would say that's probably enough of a summary.
That's good. That's a great summary because
yeah.
what we're trying to get at today is I focus just on story editing. And so with having you focus mostly on copy editing, it's really great. And one of the things that shows this is really true is that you wrote The Anatomy of Prose, which everybody on my network knows is one of my favorite books on that style. So maybe what you could do is tell us what need did you see in writers to inspire you to write The Anatomy of Prose?
So I think it was like probably twofold. The first one is that I am a super geek when it comes to prose. I mean, I really indulge when it comes to prose. I will read a book slowly, so, and I will commit sacrilege, sorry to anybody listening, and I will underline things in books, and I have like 1,000 sticky tabs in my books, and I go through and I analyze, and I literally break down another author's sentence down to the forensic level. And in doing that, I learned a lot of lessons about not necessarily like what makes good prose, because I think that is art and it's subjective, but tools and techniques that writers used to create certain effects in their prose. And so all of a sudden I had collated a lot of these tools, and I wanted to share them, one for a selfish reason, because then I consolidate that information in my own brain, but also to help other people. And that help comes to like the second reason, which is that I'd been editing for quite a while at that point, and I found myself repeating myself a lot. The same things would come up, and I would find that I ended up having these stock phrases or these stock paragraphs with stock examples that I kept in a folder because I kept seeing those same mistakes. And so I would end up copying and pasting them all. And I'm like, why am I doing this? Why don't I just put all of this into a book? So I did. And in the same way that a developmental editor like will help you on the story level, the Anatomy of Prose will help you teach yourself almost how to give yourself a developmental copy edit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you know what? And that's really exciting. So when I'm doing a story edit, I often recommend Anatomy of Prose. And the reason for that is it gives such a great description of how a writer can perform their own self-edit. And it also taught me, after reading it, while I'm doing a story edit, I can flag to people who need to go onto a copy edit, here are the things you should look at. And so as an editor, I found it a completely useful tool to help me guide the writer in the copy editing side, which I'm not an expert in. So I just thought it was fabulous for that. Now, we are going to take just a slight interlude here. Okay, come here. I have to introduce Sage because she's being a little fussy and I just need to move her to where her toys are. And Sage is with the Canadian Guide Dogs for the Blind. And we're going to have her in our home for 1.5 to 2 years before she goes on to advanced training. So that means she has to be with me 24/7, which means sometimes when I'm doing stuff like this, she's going to interrupt me. So my apologies for that.
She's adorable, though.
She really is a beautiful puppy. And now I'll put her over where her toys are and she should settle down. So let's talk about what is copy editing.
Okay, so like I know that we've had chats about this, but I personally see editing on a continuum rather than completely separate tasks, if you like. And so because of that, this is where that blurring comes. And I think that a good copy editor will, if you've handed them your manuscript and, you know, there are story problems, they will either say, I can't do this because you need a story edit first, or they will say, if you're predominantly copy editing issues and a few story issues, then they should comment on those and vice versa. So I just wanted to like clarify that. So in terms of what copy editing is, it's everything at the sentence level. And so another problem with the blurring is that what you put at the sentence level can affect story, will affect story, it should affect story. And so there's this like silk thread that you cannot detach between copy editing and story editing, and so your sentence level stuff affects your story and vice versa. So what would a copy editor look at? What would they focus on? So they look at things like cliches. Have you got too much description, or have you not got enough description in this section? Have you used metaphors that aren't actually clear and you're not evoking the imagery that you're after? They'll look at your imagery. They'll look at things like, are you repeating yourself? Do you have repeated phrases even? So like quite often when we're drafting, we'll say, the room was dark, you know, and then we'll say the room was dark, and we don't realize that we're doing that. Or you'll have phrases like, the room was black and the room was dark. Well, actually there are 1,000 different ways you can describe the room. And so they'll look at things like, have you got repetitive descriptions, even if they're not using exactly the same words? Other things will be things like too many adverbs, language and punctuation and grammar errors. So when I do a copy edit, when I do an edit, I will do everything. And I'm always very, very clear. I will do everything except your commas. A typical copy editor will look at your grammar and your punctuation. That's what they're supposed to do. Of course, they might also pick up spelling. Boring passages, they'll pick up where you've got like a whole like a page of info dumping. Another thing, I was editing a friend's manuscript the other day, and they had 3 straight pages with no dialogue, so it was all narrative prose. And I was like, this is good and I love it and I'm engaged, but it's messed up the pacing, because obviously dialogue helps pacing. They'll also pick up on things like showing versus telling, where they will pick up things like sentence length, sentence variation, your rhythm, your cadence, what else? And then like consistency things as well. So I'm trying to think. So consistency could be anything from like spellings, whether or not you're putting gaps either side of your dashes, or you're connecting them all, little things like that. Does that?
That's really good. And one of the things I just want to pull out of there that you said that's super important is when you're commenting, you're even in a copy edit, and I always push this with my story editors, is that you have to tell the writer what's working. And so by saying something positive to them, that you're engaged in the passage and here's how you could improve it, it puts the writer in the right frame of mind that, okay, there's something good here, and they don't get totally dejected. And it's really important, I believe, as an editor, to encourage your writer to see what's good. And so they can build on that and fix the stuff that needs fixing. So I love that you said that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. And I always think, because obviously as editors, we are also readers. So when we are reading your manuscript, we have two hats on. One is as a reader and the other one is as the editor. And if I've enjoyed something as a reader, I always point it out, I love how you used like the rhythm of 5 words in these consecutive sentences, or I love how you use description here, or I love the metaphor, or whatever. But yeah, so
yeah, nice.
I agree.
Nice. So out of all of that, of the manuscripts you've edited, what do you think are like the top 3 most common copy editing errors you see in someone else's novel?
So I think filtering is probably one of the most common errors. Filtering is really easily done and it's really easily removed, but you don't know what you don't know. And so filtering essentially is when you as the author put in an extra layer of narration between you and the character. So let's just say it's your protagonist rather than a point of view character. Instead of the reader looking directly through the protagonist's eyes, what happens is they stand like to the left of the protagonist and they watch the protagonist doing the thing that they're doing. And of course, there are some point of views that will remove the reader, but this is like an unintentional point of view shift. So for example, it would be like, instead of saying, the owl hooted in the trees, which doesn't have filtering, the writer would say, she heard the owl hoot in the trees. Yeah. Now, the problem with that is that hearing is what's the word? Not innate. It's implied. That's the word. Yeah. Hearing is implied when a sound is written. So it crashed or it exploded, the reader is going to hear a sound then. The reader doesn't need to be told that the character heard the explosion, because an explosion is noisy. And so, yes. So, and it's other words like she saw, he felt, she heard, things like this. Anything where you're adding an extra word in that doesn't need to be there, that is filtering. So what else?
So let's just stop on that one, because I want to say, here's our first blur the line between story editing and copy editing. So everybody out there doesn't know, but Sacha gave me some great words for explaining what is filtering. And so when I'm story editing and there's a writer who has that problem, I don't like to focus on copy editing because it takes my brain out of the story. But if I see and I think, oh, this is a repetitive problem, I take Sacha's lovely advice. And when I'm writing my summary letter back to a writer, I put in there, this is what filtering is, why it's the problem. And so what I'll do for the writer, the first few scenes, I'll just highlight it and just put the word filtering. So I'm not making any suggestions. I'm just showing them maybe 5 or 6 examples through their manuscript of what filtering is and where they do it. And then from there, the writer doesn't have to pay me to do the rest of that. They can look at it and go through their manuscript and look for she saw, she heard, she knew, she realized, she whatever, all those things, right? So although I'm not technically doing it, I'm as a story editor, I'm just guiding the writer so the writer can do it. And the next time they write, they're going to not filter because they'll know what it is.
Mm-hmm. I still remember when I learnt what filtering was, and it was like, yeah, it was a penny drop moment, because you just, you don't, unless you know, you don't know. And so it was really like a shocking moment for me.
Yep. Okay, so number 2 error, what do you see?
Okay, I would say repetition. Okay. And where where you have one form of repetition, you often have another form of repetition. So, and here's a line blur. I'll start with the non-line blur thing.
Okay.
So obviously we have, every writer will have crutch words or phrases that they use, and you often don't know that you're doing it. And unless you use a word frequency checker, or you have somebody who's really sensitive to repetition, who can pick up that thing, then you won't necessarily realize you've done it. So for example, I read a gorgeous book the other day called The 10,000 Doors of January by Alex E. Harrow. It was stunning. Historical fantasy, sort of a portal fantasy, the most elegant and rich prose I've read in a while. But her copy editor missed a few things. And I think I stopped counting once I'd read the word oil, oily, and tarry after about 8 or 9 times. And I was like, this copy editor did not run this manuscript through a word frequency checker. And here's the thing, the more unusual the word is, the less times you can use it. V.E. Schwab's Addie LaRue, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, is one of my favorite books in terms of like the quality of the prose. And still, the copy editor missed, there was I don't know how to pronounce it, but I think it was like palimpsest or something, which basically means, yeah, and it was in there like 9 times, and I was like, what? This is such an unusual word. The first time I read it, I had to look it up, and so I was like, well, now I'm going to notice. And then she used it like 9 other times or whatever it was. So yeah, the more unusual the word, the less times you can use it, the fewer times you can use it. But repetition will, so crutch phrases, crutch words come in, and they're things like just, so, but, that, then, looked, back, hand, felt. So these are all words that a lot of people will use commonly, and you need to try and get rid of some of those, or just use different ways of describing. And then you have your own crutch phrases. So for example, and I hope my critique partner won't mind me saying this, we have a bit of a joke about it now, but she used to use a phrase that said, and all at once. So all at once the character felt this, or all at once something happened. And so, I will always pick it up, and now we have a bit of a joke about it. But, there are these crutch phrases as well. And then there are descriptions that we repeat, like I mentioned earlier, like the room's dark or the room's black or whatever. But, and this is where the line blurs. Where you repeat in one way, you're likely to repeat in another way. And it's literally because we vomit these stories out. So how you start and end a scene or a chapter, are you constantly starting with dialogue in every single scene? And that's a sentence level thing, but it's also affecting the story. So this is a line blur. Do you always end your scenes with a question, or do you always end your scene with a inner monologue, or do you always end your chapter with a paragraph of description? Or are you saying little did she know? If that comes up, that's a cliche. Your copy editor is going to rip that thing out of your manuscript. So and then it gets bigger and bigger, and of course you're going to have like character archetype repetition, or you're going to have plot twist repetition, or duplicate explanations. So if you've got world building information that's in there that's duplicated, either your story editor's going to pick it up or your copy editor's going to pick it up, because it's repetition that covers 2 different types of editing. So yeah, I don't know if you want to.
I do want to comment 2 things on that. One is what you mentioned on the first part, is the importance of a professional editor should be using professional tools, because editors are human and make mistakes. And like Sacha was saying, so Pro Writing Aid's a great tool for copyediting to pick up repetitive words that, if it's a few scenes apart, you still want to get rid of it. And if the editor took a break and then came back to a scene, they might miss it too. So by using tools, they'll get it. And of course, for story editing, my tool is Fictionary Story Coach for editors to keep them comprehensive and covering everything, and Storyteller for writers to self-edit. So as a writer, you should be asking your editors, what tools are you using? And as an editor, you should be using the tools to help you so you deliver the best service. The other thing I want to mention is the repetition part. So for story editing, I look at big picture repetition. So I'll give you an example of a book I edited that had a battle scene from two different sides. And it was almost identical. And one was to show one side and one was to show the other. But you think, I just read this. Didn't I read this? And then I went back and read the other scene. I thought, nope, you can't do that. If you want to show a battle scene and you want both perspectives, it has to be different enough that the reader is learning something new. It's moving the plot forward. It can't just be a point of view perspective change. It must be something else. And so that, from a story editing point of view, is what I look at for repetition. I'll also look at bigger repetition in the sense of, revelations that come out. So big revelation comes out, don't do it twice, right? The reader, they're going to remember it. It's a biggie, so do it once. So there's story editing repetition versus copy editing repetition. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because it is a blur the line area for editors. So that brings us number 3.
Okay, so number 3 then I think is probably show versus tell, and it's such a common error that I almost didn't mention it because I was like, well, people be sick of hearing this. But I think the biggest myth around show versus tell is that you should never tell, and actually that's not true. There are plenty of times when telling is necessary. So for example, in an action scene, while you want some like maybe sound effects, or like if somebody gets stabbed, they're going to want to have some showing of the feeling and like the pain and the visceral reactions. What you don't want in a battle scene is reams and reams and reams of showing, because battles and attacks and climaxes should all be very fast scenes. So in that instance, there does need to be some telling. And so your copy editor will be looking at that balance at the sentence level. How much showing have you got versus how much telling, and how's that impacting the pace of that scene? And then they'll look at things like in that context, or maybe I will talk about that. I'm going to save that and talk about that when you ask me another question later. And then again, like in emotional scenes, is there enough, like, am I connected to that emotional scene? Even though sometimes that can be on the story editing side, as a copy editor, I'm like, well, do your sentences make me feel things? You know, do your sentences create the right imagery? Are they creating the feels? You know, have you used a rich enough metaphor to describe that first kiss? You know, that kind of thing. And so, yes, I think show versus tell is really, really important. Any time that you have an emotional scene, a scene where something is important to the protagonist, a scene where you want to draw the reader's attention to something, that's when you should be showing. Anytime that you need to transition, like from location or time, place, anytime that you need fast pace and action, those are times where you should be telling, like, for example.
Yeah, so that, again, it brings us right back to the blur the line thing, where as a story editor, I will look at, I read a whole book, and at near the end, a woman lost her baby in a miscarriage. And it was kind of told in the middle of a paragraph. You think, but that just changed all of their lives, and the story changes and their relationship changes. And so, no, you can't tell that piece. So as a story editor, I would flag that and go, you need to write this as active. And by the way, what was her reaction? What was the husband's reaction? Yeah, that has to be there. It can't be, oh, and this happened. And then you move on to the consequences of it, because it's too big for the story. Where I'm not looking at it as a story editor is minor sentence stuff. That, if a reader has a real problem, again, I will go, a writer, I will say, this is showing, this is telling, I'll flag a few, go through your manuscript when you copy edit and fix this up, kind of thing. So
I think that's like a really good example to show the difference as well. So like as a story editor, you're saying, no, this isn't good story. You need to make this emotional. And as a copy editor, I'd be saying, this sentence isn't showing the strength of emotion that you need it to. And so then I would be like helping them to tweak that sentence to evoke an even stronger emotion. But it's the story editor's job to make sure, like, that I would hope that a manuscript would come to me and that emotion would be there already because the story editor, would have done it. And then I'd be helping them to finesse it.
Yep. That's super example. So, we're talking about the term story editing a lot. I'm just going to back up just a tiny bit and go, we came up with the term story editing because when I first started out, substantive, developmental, content, structure, all those things, structural, I had to go look them all up. Like, what are these things? I don't know. Like, and so when I decided, my focus is fiction only, I decided it's a story edit. We're editing the story. And so that's why we call it story editing, to get rid of all those terms that they mean a lot in nonfiction and technical or educational editing. They have very specific meanings. But to me, story editing is just, we're looking at the story. And so that means we're looking at the characters. We're asking, why is each one in the story? We're looking at patterns. We're evaluating the structures of the scenes, and along with that, how long are the scenes? How many scenes in a chapter? Are they themed properly in a chapter? And then we're testing all of this stuff against the setting and the plot, and does it all work together? But a couple of key things a story editor must do is they must evaluate your story arc. So they have to look at, where's the inciting incident, plot point 1, midpoint, plot point 2, and the climax. And they have to tell you, are they in the right places? Are they too late and the story is dragging for that reason? They have to look at word count per scene, per chapter, and does it work for the flow and pacing and genre of your story? So young adult, much shorter scenes than a literary fiction, historical fiction adult book. Completely different genres. They have different needs. For characters, they need to be looking at, do you need all your characters? Are there characters you could combine into one so you can get rid of one, giving the reader time to get to know that character? They look at flow, and Sacha talked a little bit about that already in, entry hooks, exit hooks. Do you enter the same way all the time? So the big things that we're looking at, I want to just cover a few things of other places that the story editing and copy editing blur. And one is head hopping away from the point of view. So Sacha, maybe you just talk about what is head hopping, and why a copy editor would point this out.
So head hopping is one of these myths, a bit like showing and telling. So it gets a worse rap than show versus tell, I think. Yep. But head hopping is essentially where within a single scene, or if you have scenes that are chapters, then within a single chapter, you switch from one character's point of view, so one character narrating, let's say it's your protagonist narrating, to your love interest narrating, for example. Now, the reason that it gets a bad rep is because good fiction, and I say that in air quotes because it's all subjective, good fiction is immersive, and we should see the story through the eyes and feelings and thoughts and emotions of one character. Now, there are some genres where head hopping is more, more frequent. For example, romance, because readers want to know how both the protagonist and the love interest is feeling. Now, the difficulty comes when writers have not perfected character voice, and so they head hop between the protagonist and the love interest, and the reader can't tell the difference. So that is really, for copy editing, it's when the characters have like what Jay Thorne calls monomouth and they all sound the same. It's more of a problem than when people head hop and there are very distinctive voices. Now, that said, good practice is to complete one scene in one point of view and then move to a new character in a new point of view. Now, I just want to talk about omniscient point of view, because people will go, well, that's what people with omniscient point of view do. Well, yes and no. The difference is that the narrator will know things that the point of view characters don't know. And so that is how you can tell the difference between omniscient and then just like standard head hopping. Mm. So yeah, I think like the big problem with head hopping is a lack of distinction in character voice, and what that leads to is confusion in the reader. If you are swapping paragraph to paragraph between one character's point of view and another character's point of view, no one's going to be able to follow that. We as readers expect to be immersed for a period of time in one character's head. We can swap, if it's a new scene or if it's a new Six of Crows is a great example of this. She has 6 characters narrating, but each chapter is one character. And so we know because she labels the new chapter under the character's name, and you can tell because the voice changes depending on who is narrating. So yes, that is like the bad thing, but also, just a caveat with it that you can head hop, just these are the problems you face.
Yeah, so with that, so that's a great clarification on what you would do for copy editing. For story editing, what I'm looking at is I look at who has the point of view for the scene, and if there is head hopping, does it reduce tension? And so I use that for my, if there's a problem with tension in a scene, and an example of that could be 2 people in a room, and so the protagonist, the house is on fire, and they can't get out. And so the protagonist is panicking. Her point of view is, she's trying to figure out how can they break a window, can blah, blah, blah. And then the other person in the room sees an escape route. And so in her point of view, she's completely panicked. And in the other person's point of view, they're like, oh, we can go out that way. And then you go back to the first character's point of view. Well, no matter how panicked she feels, the reader's relaxed because they know there's an escape route. And so it's better in that case, you take that scene and play it out from the tense point of view and get rid of the other character's point of view in the scene. And so I will look at it, not at the word level, but it's one of the things I look at when I'm thinking, how come there's no tension in this scene? And quite often it's because there's been head hopping and I've been told the way out. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is backstory, because I think here's another place where we blur the line with copy editing and story editing. And you've talked a little bit about it with information dumps. That's typically where an info dump happens. But from a copy editing point of view, what other things would you point out with backstory?
So I find this one really hard because it does impact, it really blurs the line, I think. So some of the things that I will look at, even though it's more story editing, is the location of the flashback. If, for example, you dump and prologues aside, okay, if you dump a flashback really early on in your book, you are going to confuse the reader because even like at the sentence level, you are flipping them out of present time into past time. And that slows the pace of your story and it jars the reader out of the story. So in terms of like core sentence level stuff, I will be looking at things like what tenses are you using, and is it clear that if you need the tense shift, is it clear that you are shifting to the past? Have you done it one shift and then you're using the new tense, or are you all over the place because you don't know which tense you're using because you're doing a flashback? The other thing I might look at is things like triggers. Are you using a trigger to go into the flashback and then a trigger to come out of the flashback? So like at the sentence level, it might be, she handed him a key. And then that key is the trigger, and the character might be like, oh, the last time I was handed a key that looked like this, such and such and such happened, and then into the flashback you go, and then that flashback is told, and then you get to the end of it and you come back to the key, and the key the character then looks at the key again, and you shift back into present time, present tense, or whatever tense you are using to tell. So that's one thing. The other thing is that at the sentence level, if you're using a flashback, then there has to be like a reason for that. This is a problem, because I'm like, you need to use the flashback for a reason, but that reason has to be impacting the story in the present time. You can't use a flashback just for the sake of like expanding on the character's past. It has to have an impact. And so because of that, I would be saying, well, are you using sensory information to make it come alive? Are you are you using the senses in your writing? Are you using emotion at that sentence level? Why are we seeing this flashback? Is it evocative? Like, it's got, at that sentence level, flashbacks tend to be emotive because they are impacting the current story. And so I would be looking for that emotion at the sentence level. Sorry, and I knew I would struggle with this one, because I'm like, it is hard. So tightly tied.
The part of the reason it's a struggle too is because there's a difference between backstory and flashback as well, right? And so backstory is something that happened before the story. It follows all the same things that Sacha is saying, is that if you're telling backstory, it has to be related to the current story. So it's stuff that happens, and quite often it's told when it could be active, like in thought or dialogue. And quite often it happens too much at one go. So on a backstory side, I would look at that from a story editor to see, is it broken out properly? Does the reader actually need to know this piece of backstory? Where the flashback is written active, so it's actually happening in a different time. So if you think of it like time travel, we've just traveled back, we're seeing the scene active, and we come back to the present. So there's a little bit of difference between the two, but both have the same issues. And so as a story editor, I would never not mention if there's an issue with backstory or a flashback. But what I wouldn't do is go, okay, so out of these 3 paragraphs, one is relevant to the story. So I would point that out, but I would not go through and go, now to make it even better, here's your word choice, and do all the copy editing stuff. I'm going to push the writer to first get, this is the story part that's important. And it's all nice stuff to know, but the reader doesn't need to know it.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I will sometimes look at as a story editor is who has the backstory and the flashbacks, because quite often side characters can try and take over a story, and flashbacks typically, and I say typically because if you have 6 characters, all point of view, then there is a chance that any point of view character will have a flashback. So if a character is narrating, then they, I don't want to say it in black and white, can't, but there's more chance that a narrating character can have a flashback. Although the majority of them should be left for your protagonist. If you want your side characters to have them, then try and write them into the protagonist's flashback rather than giving them an entire flashback of their own, because this is the protagonist's story. Like, it can happen. There are stories that do it successfully, but I'm just giving general parameters. Backstory, though, all of your characters should have. Your side characters should have backstory. Your protagonist has backstory. How much of that is relevant depends on how major the side character is. And of course, backstory can and should be included when relevant, when it's impacting the story in the present time. And it's much shorter and can be, done in like a paragraph, and that is one of the ways that you can deepen your side characters. But yeah, I just that's sometimes a confusion, and people always say to me, "Oh, my side characters are taking over." I'm like, I know, I feel your pain.
And one thing I see on that is that there's a difference between side characters and walk-on characters, right? So that we should point out, because if we're in a restaurant, you and I are having dinner, and the server comes over and pours our wine. And that's her only function. It's creating ambiance, whatever. Um, the reader doesn't need any backstory. They don't need a name. All they need to know is that she came and interrupted our conversation that we were trying to have that was really important, or whatever it is, right? So a side character has a role driving the story forward, where a walk-on character, it's like if you think of a play, it's the person who came through, who delivered the wine and goes off. That's it. And so the reader really doesn't want to know anything about them except they put wine on the table. So there's a whole spectrum.
I happen to be writing a book called 8 Steps to Side Character, and so I have I know, how funny. I happen to have come up with a structure for side characters, and I class them as in 3 ways.
Okay.
You have a major side character, a minor side character, and a cameo. So your cameos are exactly what you said, right? A walk-on character. Have you ever seen The Matrix?
Yes.
So I think the best example of a cameo from a thing that lots of people will have seen is the lady in the red dress. So in the scene in The Matrix, this woman, they're basically in downtown New York in this computer simulation, and everybody is dressed in black and white and professional kit. And Morpheus is saying to Neo, are you paying attention? And he was paying attention until a lady in a red dress walked past. The only thing anybody remembers about this woman is that she was wearing a red dress and she was kind of cute.
Yep.
And that's the point. That's all you can remember about a cameo. You don't need anything else. So it's okay to like send them off sacrificially to the literary gods, you know. And you don't need anything more.
The purpose. That's a great example, because there was a purpose for the cameo besides just atmosphere. There was a real reason in there to the story, but you need to know no backstory.
Exactly.
Just women in the red dress. I'm going to use that in future. I love that example to explain it.
Do you want me to explain the difference between minor and major, or?
Do it.
Okay. So minor characters then are in the story more frequently than a cameo, but they don't impact the story in terms of things like a serious impact on story arc or on the protagonist. So, for example, you might have a barman that the protagonist chats to 5 times in the book. You may Mr. Filch in Harry Potter is a good example of a minor character. He is in the story, and sometimes his cat causes trouble for Harry, but he doesn't impact Harry's character arc. Okay, so these minor characters might have a teeny tiny influence on the story or plot, but not really on the protagonist or the story arc. Your major characters, however, are the ones who are likely to have their own character arc, albeit an illusion of a character arc or, a very small character arc. They may be narrating characters. They may have their own subplots, and they will have some impact on the protagonist. They will engage with the protagonist. And these are the guys who are likely to spend the most time on the page, and the ones who also have like archetypes, so the mentor, the ally, that kind of thing. So that's how I differentiate between side characters.
So when is this book coming out?
End of July. I am finishing the first round of edits this week, and then I'm giving it to one person to read just to make sure I haven't messed up, and then I will do those edits, and then it will go out to very special people like yourself.
Yes.
Get to
can't wait.
Have an advance
one of the first readers. I get to learn everything ahead of time.
Yeah.
Gives me the advantage. That's really wonderful. Well, congratulations on that. And I love the explanation of the 3. That's really, I can keep that in my head now. And I'm never forgetting the red dress either now. That's just,
I know, right?
Yeah, it's such a clear example. So thank you for that. So let's just move on to what won't a copy editor do? So let's set the expectation for a writer when they're hiring a copy editor, what they're not going to do for them.
So they're not going to look at your story arc. So like your protagonist's like main change. They're not going to look at things like word count per scene or chapter. They won't look at like scene purposes, whether they should be in there, whether they shouldn't be in there. Now, I say should because Like I said at the beginning of this thing, a good copy editor will highlight, if they can spot it early enough on in your manuscript, then they should say, actually, this is not for me. You need to go and have that first. If they get so far through, you may find that they say at the end, actually, I still feel like you need a story edit. And they may have covered some of the things to point out why you need a story edit. What else? Character development. Like typically they may look at the very sentence level to help you tweak and finesse like characterization, but they won't look at character. And I suppose there is a difference really between character and characterization. But yeah, so they won't look at character development of your side characters and your protagonist and stuff like that. I think that's,
That's good. That's great. Yeah. There's an interesting point you made there about order of editing. And, every writer has different needs. And so there's no right way or wrong way to do it. And if an editor recommends you really need you really need a story edit after copy edit, or they say, you know what, I'm not going to copy edit until you have a story edit. It's really valuable to go and do what the editor is recommending, because with a copy edit, it gets your writing voice comes out, and you learn so much from it that when you submit to a story editor who is more expensive than a copy editor, they're not distracted by all of that. They're really focusing on the story because the copy editing is clean. And when I get a book that is highly copy edited, then my brain is completely story. If I get a book that I'm editing that needs some copy editing, it's distracting for me. And so I have to try really hard to turn off my copy editing brain and just do the story editing, because that's what the writer's paying me for. And so really my overall point is there's no right way, because every writer is in a different phase of their writing journey and a different level of expertise and talent. And every writer can turn out to be a great writer wherever you are in that process. But don't be offended, and be open-minded about if an editor comes back and recommends something for you, they're doing it because they believe it's the best thing for you. Not, when I tell someone really you need to go have a copy edit, I don't get I get no job. I get, I'm doing it strictly because I think it's best for the writer. And so it's a good way to assess what your needs are. So now as a story editor, I don't focus on word choice. I don't do punctuation or grammar. With the exception, I edited a book where every piece of dialogue was punctuated incorrectly. And so I put together a short paragraph. Here is how you punctuate dialogue. I'm not going to look at it. You go through your book, because for me, then I'm not reading the dialogue, I'm reading the comma. And that's not my job as a story editor. So I will highlight repetitive issues that the writer must fix before they publish their book. And for issues like that, I also, as a story editor, I'll recommend books to read. So whatever the issue is that they're having, if it's description, I'll give a good book on description. Things that they can go away and research and figure out on their own. But I'm really trying hard not to work at the word level. So the last question I have for you is, what do you feel is your responsibility when you're hired as a copy editor? What pressure do you feel to story edit, or do you feel you're obligated to do? And I know you're both copy editor and story editor, so it must be in there, where I only do one, so I don't feel any pressure, but you do both.
So I think because of who I am and where I've pitched my career, I feel responsible to make sure not only does that writer have a good manuscript, but they go away having learned something new, so that next time their manuscript will be better. And so because of that, if I see story issues, I will highlight them to a certain extent, because of course I'm only being paid to do one thing.
Yeah.
So I will highlight the biggest issues, and not necessarily everything that I see. It's an intuitive thing. I have to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah.
And so, I might highlight 2 or 3 or 5 of the biggest story issues briefly. I won't go into reams and reams of detail if I'm just doing a copy edit. If it really needs a story edit, then my responsibility is to tell them that they need a story edit, and that either they can, I can either do that for them instead of the copy edit, or they need to go and find somebody to do that before they then give it to me for a copy edit. So like my responsibility is always to the story, no matter what. And as a copy editor, my responsibility to that story is to make sure that what the writer is saying and the what they think they're saying, it's my job to make sure that they are saying what they think they are saying.
Right.
Okay. And your job, I suppose, as a story editor, is to make sure they're telling the story they think they're telling.
That is correct. Yay.
Right. And so, yeah, I suppose that is, at the core of it, that is what my job is as a copy editor. But also it's always story first for me, so if there are story problems, I will pick them up, but not every copy editor will.
No, and that's right. And you need to know that, as if you're going in for a copy editor, don't expect any story edit. So just because it's copy edit doesn't mean the story is there. And so a writer has to be careful with that. So we're coming to the end here. So what I want to end on, Sacha, is tell people where they can find you and where they can find your books. And then I will put that information down in the notes so that everybody has access to it.
Okie dokie. So I am most frequently on Instagram, which is at Sacha Black Author. I do have a Facebook group, which is Rebel Authors. You can just type that into Facebook and you'll find it. And of course, my podcast, which is the Rebel Author Podcast. And my books are literally everywhere. Like, I publish wide. So all you have to do is type in Sacha Black, and that's SACHA. And you should find my books everywhere, on any good store, essentially.
Nice. And I love your books. I'm a fan. I read them even early. So, I highly encourage everybody to read the fiction, the nonfiction. They're super good books. Sacha clearly knows what she's talking about. And thank you for talking to me about the blurry lines between copy editing and story editing.
Oh, thank you for having me. I've had a blast.